This is Polyamory Weekly, number 25 for September 6, 2005. Coming up on this week's show, all Dossie, all Janet, all the time. Dossie Easton and Janet Hardy weigh in on whether poly is all about the sex, the relationship between BDSM and polyamory, jealousy, and the role of role-playing. Hello, and welcome to Polyamory Weekly, episode 25 for September 6, 2005. For our under 18 listeners, this is an adult-oriented podcast about really lascivious things like communication and honesty in relationships. If you are under 18 and looking for upfront advice and answers to questions about sex, please visit scarletteen.com and turn off your iPod now. Hello and welcome, everyone. I am Minx, your host, and I'm so excited. Yep, you heard that intro right. We finally got the interview down with Dossie Easton and Janet Hardy. We actually ended up talking for almost an entire hour, so I'm splitting up the interview, half of it for this week's show, and you know how I like to tease, half of it for next week's show. That's right. And it works out really well for me, actually, because I have a huge, long show myself coming up, and I was worried that I would not have time to give you all the Polyamory Weekly high-quality content that you have come to know and love. Yes, that's sarcastic. Anyway, so after next week's episode, yes, we'll get back to the regular listener mail segments. I'm sure we'll have lots of topics and comments after that. But for this week and next week, I am just recording beginning, intro, and conclusion, and Dossie and Janet are doing all the rest. And I will ask for a little bit of patience with the recording. We did do the phone call over Skype, and it actually took quite a bit to edit. Not to edit, bits in and out of it, but simply that the audio quality, it seemed like everyone was speaking at a different volume, so I had to painstakingly go through and amplify Janet and Dossie individually so you would be sure to hear them, and then take my volume down because mine was very low. So, if you hear beeps and background noises and stuff, please just be patient and understand that, hey, I'm not an audio engineer. I'm doing this with an iBook and a USB mic. So, without further ado, the first half of the interview with the lovely and talented Dossie Easton and Janet Hardy. And first of all, let me thank both of you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedules to do this interview.
Oh, our pleasure. My pleasure, yeah.
Yay. And, I guess I should introduce you guys. We are here in the studio, or actually across the country via Skype, with Dossie Easton and Janet Hardy. And if you don't already know, they are the authors of The Ethical Slut and Radical Ecstasy, and founders of the Greenery Press, and the new topping book, and the new bottoming book, and Kinky Crafts, and what else am I missing?
Oh, a few things, but some of us did one of those things and some of us did the others. So we're not monolithic in this. I'm the founder of the Greenery Press, and I wrote Kinky Crafts. This is Janet speaking. We wrote The Ethical Slut and Radical Ecstasy, and New Topping Book and New Bottoming Book, and When Someone You Love Is Kinky. And then I, as an individual, wrote Sexually Dominant Woman and Kinky Crafts and The Complete Spanker and The Toy Bag Guide to Canes and Caning.
And I do apologize for that. I do tend to think of you as one monolithic. And you are two individual, separate, wonderful people.
Yes, that we are.
So I actually asked listeners to write in and ask, what they would ask you if they had the chance. And we had some very interesting questions. Mm-hmm. So the first one I'd like to ask is polyamory really about the sex?
We tend to believe that just about everything is really about the sex. So we may not be the right people to ask about this. Is polyamory more about the sex than, say, cooking breakfast? Well, it depends on how you're doing polyamory, I think.
Yeah, and one of the reasons we think everything is about, or lots of things are about the sex, is we don't necessarily draw that much of a line. I think one of the whole ideas of polyamory is that is kind of the question of why would you not extend intimacy into sexual connection? Because there's so much sexual energy that runs through our emotional connections.
The reason that question was asked is because the tagline for the show is because it's not all about the sex, and we spend a lot of time talking about communication and honesty in relationships, and a little bit about the sex.
Well,
let's consider that part of the sex.
Yeah, so you have to do those things in order to get to the stuff. To get to the sex or the intimacy or the eros or whatever it is that you're after. You don't just reach out and grab that stuff. You have to do some work to get it and to maintain it. I hate to contradict your slogan, but in some ways it is all.
I would also point out that a great deal of our relationships are marked by our worrying that sex should not be there. And if I'm in a relationship and then I make friends with somebody, that raises a lot of questions about, oh dear, is there going to be sex? And, it's like sex is there even when it's not there.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
In a world where it's so forbidden.
Well, and I think that really came across, too, in the, unfortunately, Dossie, I missed your seminar at Ohio Leather Fest, although Gray Dancer attended. And but Janet, I think that really came across in your, I think it was Intuiting Your Bottom seminar?
Intuition and Reading Your Bottom.
Intuition and Reading Your Bottom. And it really, that demonstration was incredibly powerful. We talked about it on the last show, that there was no sex taking place, but it was, the energy was so strong, and it was a type of sexual energy, but there were also a lot of other aspects to the energy as well.
One of the questions that comes up a lot, particularly when we're talking about polyamory, I did a lot of radio interviews back for Ethical Slut when it first came out, and without exception, every one of these, little Howard Stern wannabes that I was getting at the 4 a.m. to talk to, asked the question, so Ms. Liz, tell me, how many people have you had sex with? And my answer was always the same. It was, I'll tell you what, you tell me your definition of sex, people I've had it with. The response I got was always the same, which was, sex. But I would argue that, I did that demo twice that weekend, and both times, not in neither case did we pull off our panties and hop on board and go at it, but I would say there was sex going on in both of them. It was not genital sex, but we were connecting in a way that was profoundly erotic and pulling up energies that I identify as sexual. So, I think it's probably a fallacy to think that you can draw this hard line and say, well, now these two people over here, they're having sex, and those two people over there, they're not. Because I think what makes it clearer is acknowledging that sexual energy runs between everybody at all times, and sometimes that goes over in certain kinds of activity, and sometimes it doesn't, but it's there. And what we were doing in those demos is consciously rousing it, bringing it up. And, if we didn't choose to act on that with our genitals, then okay, we didn't. It wasn't appropriate in that time at that place, but it was there.
Right, then that doesn't mean there wasn't sex.
Pardon me?
It's interesting to think that our conferences, a lot of what we do in terms of SM gatherings is predicated on the notion that people decide that our activities are legal because we keep our panties on. But genital sex is only one part of sex. The legal definition makes it possible for us to get together and share other forms of sex in startlingly public places, just because it's not genital. But our definition of sex ranges far, far, far beyond rubbing genitals together.
What is the legal definition of sex?
Depends on what state you're in.
What state are you in, and do you count things like lewd and lascivious behavior? And that's pretty much a null question.
I always count lewd and lascivious behavior, but I'm originally from Texas.
Count on it.
In Texas, I think pretty much everything that I do is a crime.
Uh-huh. Well, I was teaching in Texas once and hauling along my monster toy bag full of, whips and vibrators and bondage and whatnot. And I realized at one point it was a sort of a weird shock that if I were carrying my gun case, which I don't have one, but if I did, I'd be fine. The fact that I was carrying this toy bag was probably putting me on the wrong side of the law.
This is true. Actually, you could carry a bunch of guns in Texas, but there is a quirky law that says if you own more than 6 vibrators, then you have an intent to distribute, and that's illegal, and they can throw you in jail.
Yes.
Not only that, the anti-pornography laws are used to outlaw dildos as representations of a penis.
Mm-hmm.
I just love Texas so much.
Well, the Alabama Supreme Court is the one that ruled that the laws against vibrators could stay in place because the right to a vibrator was not a right. The right to have an orgasm was several women filed suit saying we can't have orgasms without our vibrators. The Alabama Supreme Court said whoever told you had a right to have an orgasm. It's a bad country.
Do we see an amendment to the Bill of Rights here?
The right to a vibrator-induced orgasm.
I think pursuit of happiness fits into this one just fine. But that's just me. Anyway, so does that answer your question?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And some other questions I didn't ask, which are always the more interesting ones. And this is something that I had been really interested in, and some other listeners had written in as well. And you mentioned the ethical slut. There aren't many references to BDSM in the ethical slut. What do you see as the relationship between polyamory and the BDSM lifestyle?
First of all, we actually wrote the original bottoming book and topping book before we wrote Slut. So
really?
We were writing about SM already. Because Slut is about polyamory and therefore directed to a wider audience, we did not include SM as a subject, as its central subject matter, although I think it's mentioned a few times, but not from that point of view. My experience in doing workshops and a lot of therapy, because I'm a therapist in private practice, and since we wrote Slut, I get a lot of polyamorous couples and triads and so on coming into my practice for counseling. Is that SM people have a tendency to be more conscious of all the different roles that we play in sex, all the different ways that we like to play. And in that sense, tend to have a more experience and commitment to polyamory. If every one of my lovers is sort of a mirror to a different part of myself, in which I can experience myself, see myself as that particular part, the top, the bottom, the aggressive person, the little girl, the victim, the bully, all these different roles that we play. So we are sort of almost polyamorous within ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so we have a tendency to get really motivated and to create lifestyles that involve a bunch of different relationships that are defined very differently. So I think SM people tend to naturally gravitate toward polyamory more than people in other lifestyles might.
Mm-hmm. The other difference I see is that SM people really get it in their bones that sex is not binary, that there are all sorts and kinds and gradations of sexual interaction, and that you can't just sort of say, okay, well, we're monogamous and consider the subject closed. Because when you get into questions like, well, okay, we only have genital sex together, but is it okay if he ties her up? Then the question is not clear-cut anymore. And so there's an understanding that none of the answers are simple ones. When you get out in straight land, you just sort of you get people who assume that, okay, we're monogamous, but they forget to ask about questions like cybersex or phone sex that are sort of on the edge of what we consider sexuality. And of course, the question of what isn't sex got enacted at the very highest levels of our country in recent memory. Within SM land, we get that already. you have to be clear and specific about what behaviors you're including and excluding if you want to negotiate either monogamy or poly with someone.
That's definitely true. I think in our first BDSM negotiations, it was very common for Grey Dancer's wife, Genevieve, or myself to say, okay, well, scening is fine, but anything sexual, and then we kind of went, wait.
Yeah.
For someone who gets wet from a flogging, that's sexual. So,
exactly.
You know, how do you define sex and sexual?
Let me first, and then you. The very first workshop I ever taught on this, that we ever taught on this, we were in the early days of researching the ethical slut and kind of wanted to see what people were thinking about. And so we started the workshop, as we often do, by saying, just so we know who we're talking to here, can we get a show of hands about how many people in the audience consider themselves monogamous? And, it was an SM audience, and monogamy is not the norm. And, maybe 3 hands in the audience went up, all well and good, except for one of them belonged to a woman in whom I had my personal fist not 2 nights before. And, of course, I was not going to out her in front of the audience, but I'm sitting back there thinking, okay, what odd definition of this of monogamy is this that I don't understand? And it turned out that to her and her husband, monogamy meant that they only had penis-vagina intercourse together. Anything else with anybody else was fine. And to them, that was monogamy. So, okay, all well and good. They knew what they wanted and what they didn't want. But it really startled me because, where I come from, fisting is very close to the center range of what would be considered sex. And
it's fairly intimate, yeah.
That from their monogamy agreement was very odd. I'm sorry.
And I think that we want to look at when you start looking at these definitions, you have to look at, well, why do people care?
Yeah.
They care because they're afraid of feeling jealous. And jealousy is a very irrational sort of conglomeration of feelings. It's not really one feeling. People experience jealousy very differently. And for one person, it might be rage. For another, it might be fear of abandonment, But as far as what activities are likely to arouse jealousy, well, frankly, that extends far, far, far beyond genital sex because people feel threatened by, whatever kind of connection people make. And so I don't encourage my clients who are trying to work out their agreements around polyamory, if they're having a hard time to imagine that they're not going to experience jealousy over something that is other than a connection that's other than genital sex, because they are. My sense is, as polyamorous, that if we're going to be polyamorous, what we need to do is we need to do the work of learning how to take care of our jealousy, how to take care of ourselves when we're jealous. And remember, if I'm jealous of my partner, then chances are there's a situation going on in which I can't actually rely on my partner to take care of me at that moment in time. If my partner is off on a date with somebody else, I'm not a very good polyamorist if I call up on the cell phone and say, stop what you're doing and come home now, I'm having a feeling. So we have to learn, the burden is always on the individual to say, the burden, and I think the joy is always on the individual to say, I am making a commitment here to learn how to take care of myself when I have jealous feelings. Not that I'll never have them. I still do, and I've been non-monogamous. I made a vow of non-monogamy in 1969. So it's 36 years later, and yes, I still feel jealous, and I know how to take care of myself when I do. So it's sort of a non-event. Does that make sense? It's not like a big deal. I don't have to run or get crazy or, freak out. It's just like, oh, look, there I am feeling jealous. It's sort of like feeling like you're cold and you want to turn the heat up.
I'm laughing because 69, the year I was born. So how do you take care of yourself when you're jealous?
I think mostly along the lines of be kind to yourself. It's sort of like taking care of yourself if you stub your toe,
Well, it's the same way you would take care of somebody else who was feeling jealous. You would pet them. You would ask them what they wanted. You would make sure they were physically comfortable and maybe getting some sort of treat. The way you would take care of a friend who called you up and said, help me out, I'm feeling jealous here. That's basically what's happened, except you're the friend and you're the person who's feeling jealous.
And there may be longer time spans. So some of the ways to take care of you are to, go to a movie with a friend on an evening when your partner is out with someone else, or make sure that you're taking care of your needs. Make sure, obviously, that the communication and the closeness in your primary relationship, if you have one, is being taken care of. And the thing that I keep wanting to underline about this is taking care of yourself in ways that are being kind to yourself. A lot of people start feeling an unwelcome feeling like jealousy, and they're like, oh my God, what did I do wrong? I'm just a fool. I'll never make it. I'll never succeed at this. I'm an idiot. I'm uptight. Whatever, right? Don't trash yourself. It's like, that's one of the reasons that I use stubbing your toe as a metaphor, because we might have a minute of, oh my God, how could I have been so stupid? But then we go on and say, well, this hurts, and do I want to put ice on it or warmth or, hold it and say nice things to the poor thing until it heals? Being kind to yourself means that you don't have to fear being jealous anymore, because if that feeling comes up, then you're going to do something nice for yourself. Even if it's go get an ice cream or a flower or something, you're going to remember that you are a valuable person. And treat yourself well, and then jealousy can't hurt you.
That's wonderful. I like that idea that, if I get jealous, I get to treat myself to an ice cream cone or something nice.
Mm-hmm. I find in my own life that solitude is always something that's in slightly short supply for me. And so for me, what would otherwise probably be a trigger for jealousy is often like, whoa, you mean I get the house to myself? Cool. I get to go out. I love to go by myself to a restaurant or a movie. That's a big treat for me. But I don't get that often. And so, for me, the situation that might otherwise cause jealousy tends to be an opportunity. Woohoo.
Wonderful.
And that's all individual to people. A person, for instance, who is jealousy with a lot about fear of abandonment might not find the solitude comforting. Everything is. I don't think there is an emotion called jealousy, to tell you the truth. I think it's a whole umbrella word for all the range of emotions that can come up around non-monogamy, insecurity, territoriality, fears of abandonment, fears of being unlovable. And these are deep fears for all of us.
Oh, yeah. Abandonment's a big one with me.
Yeah, and mine tends to manifest as competitiveness. And, that's...
Oh, really?
Yeah. You think she can take a flogging, you should see the flogging I can take.
So what do you do when you realize that thought is in your head?
Try to remind myself that this is not a competition. I really loathe that part of the SM community that likes to make things into competitions, and there's a lot of that out there. People who want to be the biggest, baddest, bottom or top in the world, regardless of whether that means they're showing their partner a good time or not. Just basically so that they can pound their chests and show off to everybody else. And I think the reason it drives me as crazy as it does is because that's a real shadow for me. The desire to win, to be bigger and better and tougher than all the other sadomasochists. And since intellectually I believe that to be really a negative thing, both for me as a person and for the SM community as a whole, I just try to sort of bust myself on it when I catch myself doing it. And turn my thoughts to what a good time I might be having, or they might be having, and remind myself that that's really where, why we're doing this. It's not about setting records, it's about having a good time.
So you guys somebody mentioned role-playing a while back. So this is a question from Great Answer. He asked, have you role-played Samwise and Gollum yet, and how was it?
I'm a pretty big geek, and I've role-played a Cardassian interrogator with a Bajoran lieutenant, which is the geekiest scene I've ever personally done, but we have not gone there yet. I'm not saying it couldn't happen.
Do you have a favorite role-playing scene?
Oh, Most of our favorite role plays are me as some sort of sociopathic, bully, nasty male person, and her as a helpless victim. And that acts itself out in any number of iterations, but they all kind of cook back down. You know, she has this sort of persona that she calls the girl in white. You know, at the beginning of every women's prison movie, there's the sweet little wrongfully imprisoned innocent good girl.
In the white nightie.
I need to watch more women's prisons movies.
Pardon me?
I need to watch more women's prison movies because I've never actually seen that.
We should all watch more women's prison movies.
Are there any women's prison movies you would recommend?
No, they could be kind of hot stuff. But that's really core persona for both of us. Is for me to, we call it victim and villain. And in Radical Ecstasy, we actually have a story about a scene we did, and we write it back and forth from our 2 points of view, a victim and villain scene. And that's a really sort of healing role play for both of us. And so we tend to go back to that one as a favorite over and over again.
That brings up a good question. What do you get out of the role play that you wouldn't get out of a scene without the role play?
Can I take that?
Yeah, that's your stuff. Go for that.
I actually have a theory about this that I think I was, I taught it at Columbus actually in the emotional journeying workshop. We have a lot of parts of ourselves, feelings and constructs and bits of ourselves, a lot of them from when we were children, that we have kind of cut off because they were painful, scary, difficult. Carl Jung defined a sort of region of the mind, although it's really more of a function that he called the shadow. But it's as if we sent parts of our experience off, telling ourselves they were unbearable, intolerable, can't do that, can't feel that, no, can't go there, not all right, and forbade ourselves to be conscious of them. Said, okay, I'm not going to be aware of that. And a lot of those things have to do with items that show up in SM stories. Our precious inner victims. It's very forbidden to be a victim, to be pathetic in this culture. Our precious inner bullies. The parts of us that were angry, where we were shamed and told we mustn't be. The parts of us that were frightened. Whatever. There's a lot of social forbidden, too. That's one of the reasons why the role of slut is so popular in SM play. What I believe is that as we split off these parts of ourselves because we were told we shouldn't have them or because they were too painful or frightening, then that creates a dilemma. You very much got Dossie, the psychotherapist, speaking here, in which we are drawn to somehow find a way to welcome those parts back. Because saying something is forbidden to consciousness, you can't just bury something in the mind and then forget it. It's still there. It doesn't go away. A lot of healing in therapy, especially healing of major trauma, is about learning ways, again, to take care of yourself. This is my constant theme. So that you can remember horrible things like child abuse or whatever, right? And I believe that SM is a way to bring those things into consciousness and satisfy that need to become ultimately a more whole person, to have all the parts of ourselves. So if I role play a little child who's being abused, I am going back into, and my top is helping me go back into the shadowy part of the world of all the things that were terrifying to me in the actual child abuse I experienced, and I did. Except there's a huge difference. I'm in a controlled circumstance. We're role-playing. Nobody's going to kick me down the back stairs because they know that's too dangerous. We get to choose the outcome, and we're eroticizing it. And to me, that's the most beautiful piece of it, because we're doing this. I'm doing this with another person to validate me that part of me is not disgusting and unlovable. And then we're going to what? We're going to end maybe with an orgasm or with some good thing that gives this nasty old story an injection of the life force And I think there's a tremendous healing power in that. So it gives me ways to welcome back parts of myself that were too scary. Using stuff that was scary when we were children is probably the most intense way to look at that. But the truth is that scary forbidden stuff happens all the time. How many tops welcome the time. I remember a scene I wrote about in Bottoming book where I was very angry and upset about being dumped in a relationship I'd been in, and a friend of mine agreed to take some of that energy in a beating at a play party. And the beating, it was a caning, and it got very dramatic. It was very intense. And at one point I came up to check with her just to make sure she was all right, and she turned her head around to me and said, "I'm in ecstasy. I love your shadow." And that was like this huge healing thing to me. I was so full of anger, both at the person who dumped me and at myself, like we often are in these circumstances. And she just thought my shadow, my difficult stuff was hot and intimate and powerful, and it was fabulous, just fabulous.
That is wonderful. That's just sending shivers down me, because while I missed your emotional journey class at Ohio Leatherfest, unfortunately, I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is the big benefit of role-playing is it's a way to sort of bring out and accept and acknowledge and deal with your shadow self.
Or selves, plural. Most
or selves, yeah, that's true. There's usually more than one. But what a wonderful... It gave me shivers when you said, what the woman said back to you, that she loved your shadow. That it's something we tend to hide, obviously, and not only to bring it out, but acknowledge it, but have someone else acknowledge and benefit from it. It just gives me shivers. That's what it's all about.
There's an enormous amount of juice in that vulnerability too. It's very sexy stuff. It's very juicy.
Since I'm usually the vulnerable one in scenes, I'll agree with that.
Don't imagine that tops are not in a vulnerable position. They are. At least if they're any good, they are.
And see, I've never been a top. We haven't found the top in me yet. There might be something there, haven't found it. So I have trouble relating to that particular point of view. Although I have seen my top vulnerable, for sure.
There's a story we tell in the new topping book that was kind of the generative scene for the new topping book. And this was a scene we did many years ago. It was kind of the first scene in which I went into that sort of bully villain persona. We were at a play party. And I call it the scene that started in the wardrobe department, because when we negotiated the scene, I said, "So what kind of scene do you want to do at the party?" And she said, "I don't know, but I want to wear one of my prom dresses." So from that, what evolved was this scene where she was the queen of the prom, and I was the juvenile delinquent who kidnaps her from the prom at knife point.
Yummy.
And so I waited until she was at John, and then when she stepped out all in her, foofy pink tulle thing, I was waiting behind the door with a switchblade, and I put the knife to her throat and said, "Don't you fucking move, bitch." And took her downstairs at knife point and tied her to a table and, tortured her and did all sorts of fabulous, nasty things to her. But the whole time, there was this dialogue coming out of my mouth about, it was of the, I'm going to show, stuck-up little bitches like you what you're good for, kind of dialogue. I had no idea that was in my brain. I didn't know I knew how to say things like that. And it was an amazing, fabulous scene. And we finished it, and, I swept all the toys off the table into the bag and lay down with her and cuddled, and we did aftercare, and all well and good, all according to plan. And then we decided to go upstairs and get something to eat. So, at the bottom of the stairs I was fine, and by the time we got to the top of the stairs, my hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't have picked something up. And we got to the food room, and she sat down in a chair, and I just collapsed in this little puddle at her feet. And said, "Would you just, kind of pet me for a while, please?" And so she just kind of petted me for, 40 minutes. And it was several days after that I was calling her up, needing to hear that we were okay. that she hadn't taken that persona seriously, that she still saw me as me, that she wasn't mad, that she wasn't frightened. It was really terrifying for me. It put me in an immensely vulnerable place. So I use that story a lot because it's such a nice, clear-cut example of the vulnerability of the top.
It is.
You know, I'm a switch, and for me, the vulnerability of topping is much greater than the vulnerability of bottoming. It goes to deeper places in me that are tenderer. No, that's Janet's theory of topping.
I just had this great image remembering back then of sitting in this chair and Janet sitting on the floor between my legs, and I'm petting her, and she's all surrounded in pink tulle.
Yes. I'm just using all the with the sleeves rolled up. Yes, I'm in this sea of pink tulle in the middle of it, in my jeans with my skin-tight T-shirt with the sleeves rolled up and my hair slicked back. And there's this sort of rising and falling ocean of pink tulle all around me.
That's just hot. And thanks again to Janet and Dossie for working so hard to coordinate their schedules, and they actually ended up, this was at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning when they were kind enough to take time out of their schedules and lay down the interview. And you could see it was really worth it for you guys because, wow, what wonderful insights they have on the world of polyamory, BDSM, and sex and monogamy in particular. I just found it completely fascinating. So if you have comments or questions or feedback, email me, cunningminx, CUNNINGMINX, @gmail.com. And also in the second half of the interview, you'll find out more. But, of course, all of Dossie and Janet's books are available at the press that Janet founded, Greenery Press, available online at www.greenerypress.com. So thanks again. One last time, with feeling, to Dossie and Janet for that fabulous interview. And, of course, if you want a summary, find out more what they did in the interview, you can always check out our show notes page at www.livejournal.com/users/Polyamory Weekly. And coming up on the second half of the interview next week. After gay marriage, will there be more sex with goats? Will there ever be an ethical slut too? And if so, what would it include? The difficulties of coming out. How have their approaches to poly changed over the years? And of course, more on their upcoming workshops on this Tantra stuff, otherwise known as the Radical Ecstasy workshops. And they do have some upcoming in Austin, Texas, and in Vancouver. So stay tuned to find out more. Thanks for listening, everyone, and remember, hey, Janet and Dossie said, it is all about the sex.